October 8th, 2024. Sarah Sullivan was tending to her garden behind her small house in rural Pennsylvania when she heard the knock at her front door. At 73 years old, Sarah rarely received unexpected visitors, and she certainly wasn't expecting anyone who would change her understanding of the past 50 years of her life. But the man standing on her doorstep was someone she had given up hope of ever seeing again. He was older, grayer, and marked by decades of hardship that had carved deep lines into his face. But his eyes were unmistakably familiar, the same green eyes that had looked into hers 50 years earlier when he had promised a return from Vietnam. "Sarah?" the man said, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah, it's me. It's Michael." Michael Sullivan had been 22 years old when he left for Vietnam in 1974, promising his 23-year-old pregnant wife that he would be home in time for the birth of their first child. Sarah had been 6 months pregnant when Michael deployed, and she had spent the remaining months of her pregnancy counting days until his promised return. But Michael never came home from Vietnam. His unit was reported missing in action during the final months of American involvement in the war, and despite years of Sarah's desperate inquiries to military, Michael Sullivan was never found, never confirmed dead, and never officially declared anything other than missing. For 50 years, Sarah had lived with the uncertainty of not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead, whether he had chosen not to return or been unable to return, and whether their son David would ever meet the father he had never known. The man standing at Sarah's door in 2024 would answer all those questions and reveal a story of survival, captivity, and a 50-year journey home that had tested every limit of human endurance and determination. Michael Sullivan had kept his promise to return. It had just taken him 5 decades to find his way home to the family he had never stopped trying to reach. Michael and Sarah Sullivan had been high school sweethearts in the small Pennsylvania town of Millerville, where everyone knew everyone and young couples were expected to marry, start families, and build lives that mirror their parents' experiences. Michael worked at the local steel mill after graduation, while Sarah worked as a secretary at the town's only bank. They had married in 1973. Just as the Vietnam War was winding down, but still requiring young men to serve their military obligations. Michael's draft number had been called in late 1973, and he had reported for duty with the understanding that his service would be brief. The war was ending, American troops were being withdrawn, and most newly drafted soldiers were being assigned in non-combat roles. "I'll be home by Christmas," Michael had promised Sarah when he received his deployment orders in February 1974. "This war is almost over, and they're just sending me to help with the cleanup operations. I'll probably never see any real fighting." Sarah was 3 months pregnant when Michael left for basic training, and 6 months pregnant when he deployed to Vietnam in May 1974. They had planned for Michael to request emergency leave when the baby was born, but both of them expected him to be home permanently well before their child's arrival. Michael's letters during his first months in Vietnam had been optimistic and frequent. He wrote about the beautiful Vietnamese countryside, the friendly South Vietnamese soldiers he worked alongside, and his anticipation of returning home to meet his son or daughter. His unit was assigned to support operations during the American withdrawal, helping to transport equipment and personnel as combat operations wound down. The baby should start kicking soon, Michael had written in a letter dated August 15, 1974. "I wish I could be there to feel those little feet. Tell him or her that Daddy is counting the days until we can meet." But Michael's letter stopped arriving in September 1974, just as Sarah was entering her final trimester of pregnancy. Her inquiries to the military about Michael's unit received vague responses about operational security and classified missions that made it impossible to provide specific information about individual soldiers' locations or status. David Sullivan was born on November 12, 1974, 3 weeks after the last letter Sarah had received from Michael. She had given birth alone, holding on to the hope that Michael's absence was temporary and that he would walk to the hospital door at any moment to meet his newborn son. But as weeks turned into months without word from Michael, Sarah's hope began to transform into fear, confusion, and eventually a desperate need for answers that the military seemed unable or unwilling to provide. The official notification came in March 1975, nearly 6 months after Michael's last letter. A uniformed officer arrived at Sarah's door to inform her that Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan's unit had been reported missing during operations near the Cambodian border, and that despite extensive search efforts, no trace of the unit had been found. Missing in action was not the same as killed in action, the officer explained. It meant that Michael's fate was unknown, that he could be dead, captured, injured, or simply lost in the chaos of a war zone. The military would continue searching, but Sarah should prepare for the possibility that Michael might never be found. Sarah Sullivan would spend the next 50 years raising their son alone, while never knowing whether Michael was alive or dead. But what she didn't know was that Michael had been fighting his own battle for survival, captured by forces that had no intention of ever letting American prisoners return home. The years following Michael's disappearance were the most difficult of Sarah's life. She was a 24-year-old single mother with no extended family support, minimal financial resources, and a baby who would grow up never knowing his father. The military provided a small survivor's benefit, but it wasn't enough to maintain the life she and Michael had planned together. Sarah moved in with Michael's elderly parents, who helped care for baby David, while Sarah worked multiple jobs to support their small household. But Michael's parents died within 5 years of his disappearance, leaving Sarah truly alone with the responsibility of raising David and keeping alive the memory of a father he couldn't remember. As David grew older, he naturally asked questions about his missing father that Sarah couldn't answer. Was Michael dead? If so, where was his body, and why hadn't the military found him? Was he alive but unable to return? If so, why hadn't he contacted his family or found a way to communicate his location? Your father loved us very much, Sarah would tell David whenever he asked about Michael. If he could come home to us, he would. The fact that he hasn't returned means something terrible happened to him, not that he chose to stay away. But privately, Sarah struggled with doubts and questions that she couldn't share with her son. Had Michael been killed in action and his body never recovered? Had he been captured and died in captivity? Or was there a possibility that he was still alive somewhere, unable to return but hoping someone was still looking for him? Sarah never remarried, despite encouragement from friends who pointed out that she was young and deserving of companionship. She couldn't imagine building a new life with someone else while Michael's fate remained unknown. What if he was alive and eventually found his way home? How could she explain that she had given up on him and moved on with another man? Instead, Sarah dedicated herself to raising David as a single mother while maintaining hope that someday she would learn the truth about Michael's disappearance. She contacted the military regularly, requesting updates on search efforts and investigations. She wrote to congressmen, veterans organizations, and missing in action advocacy groups, seeking any information about American soldiers who might still be held in Southeast Asia. But as years turned into decades, the likelihood of Michael's return seemed increasingly remote. The Vietnam War became a distant memory for most Americans, and the military's efforts to locate missing soldiers were scaled back as resources were redirected to more current conflicts. By the 1990s, Sarah had largely accepted that Michael was probably dead and that she would never learn the specific circumstances of his death. She focused on helping David build his own life, watching him graduate from college, marry a wonderful woman named Jennifer, and start his own family with grandchildren who would never meet their grandfather Michael. What Sarah didn't know was that Michael Sullivan was very much alive, and that he had been spending 50 years trying to find his way back to the family he had promised he would return to. Michael Sullivan's 50-year absence hadn't been by choice. He had been captured by Cambodian forces and held as a prisoner for decades, forgotten by governments and abandoned by the military systems that were supposed to protect him. His survival had depended on never giving up hope that someday he would see his family again. On September 23, 1974, Michael Sullivan's unit had been assigned to a reconnaissance mission near the Cambodian border, searching for evidence of North Vietnamese supply routes that were still being used despite the Paris Peace Accords. The mission was supposed to be routine, gather intelligence, take photographs, and return to base without engaging enemy forces. But Michael's unit had been ambushed by Cambodian soldiers who were allied with North Vietnamese forces but not bound by the ceasefire agreements that officially ended American combat operations in Vietnam. The ambush had been swift and devastating. Most of Michael's unit was killed immediately, but Michael and 3 other American soldiers were captured alive and transported across the border into Cambodia. For the next 30 years, Michael and his fellow prisoners have been held in remote jungle camps by Cambodian forces who had no intention of releasing American prisoners or notifying international authorities about their captivity. The prisoners were used as forced labor, building infrastructure projects, and working in agricultural operations that supported the local military groups. Michael's captors had told him repeatedly that America had abandoned all prisoners in Southeast Asia, that no one was looking for missing soldiers, and that his family had been told he was dead and had moved on with their lives. These psychological tactics were designed to break the prisoner's spirit and eliminate their hope of rescue or escape. But Michael had never stopped believing that Sarah was waiting for him, that his child, whose gender he still didn't know, was growing up hoping to meet their father someday. This belief had sustained him through decades of captivity, forced labor, malnutrition, and physical abuse that would have broken most people. "I made a promise to come home," Michael would tell his fellow prisoners during their darkest moments. "I'm going to keep that promise, no matter how long it takes." Michael had attempted escape multiple times over the years, but the remote jungle locations and hostile terrain made successful escape nearly impossible. The few prisoners who had managed to get away from the camps had either been recaptured quickly or had died in the jungle from starvation, disease, or attacks by wild animals. As years passed, some of Michael's fellow prisoners had given up hope and accepted their fate as permanent captives. Others had died from illness, exhaustion, or despair. But Michael had maintained his determination to return home, even when that goal seemed impossible to achieve. The opportunity for escape had finally come in 2003, when political changes in Cambodia had led to the abandonment of some remote military camps. Michael and 2 other surviving American prisoners had managed to escape during the chaos of a camp relocation, but it had taken them nearly 20 more years to navigate the complex process of proving their identities and finding assistance to return to the United States. Michael's escape from captivity in 2003 should have been the end of his ordeal, but returning to America after 30 years of imprisonment would prove almost as challenging as surviving captivity itself. The country and military he had served no longer acknowledged that soldiers like him existed. When Michael Sullivan finally escaped from his Cambodian prison camp in 2003, he discovered that returning home would require navigating a bureaucratic nightmare that had no procedures for handling American prisoners who had been held captive for decades without official documentation. Michael had no identification, no military records that could be easily verified, and no way to prove his identity to American authorities who had long ago presumed he was dead. The Defense Department had no active files on Michael Sullivan or his missing unit, and his military service records had been archived in ways that made them difficult to access and verify. More challenging was the fact that Michael's story of 30-year captivity in Cambodia seemed impossible to believe. American officials were skeptical of claims about long-term prisoners being held in Southeast Asia, particularly prisoners who had supposedly been held for decades without any communication or documentation of their captivity. Michael spent nearly 2 years in refugee camps and diplomatic facilities, while American officials tried to verify his identity and determine the legitimacy of his claims. During this time, he was not allowed to contact his family or return to the United States, because bureaucrats couldn't confirm he was actually an American citizen or veteran. The verification process was complicated by the fact that many of Michael's identifying characteristics had changed during his 30 years of captivity. He had lost significant weight. His appearance had been altered by decades of malnutrition and hard labor, and he had scars and injuries that weren't documented in his original military medical records. But the most heartbreaking aspect of Michael's bureaucratic ordeal was learning about everything he had missed during his 50 years of absence. American officials eventually confirmed his identity, but they also informed him about the family he had left behind. Sarah had never remarried but had raised their son David as a single mother. David was now an adult with his own family, and Michael had 3 grandchildren he had never met. Michael also learned that both of his parents had died decades earlier, still believing their son was missing in action. Sarah's parents had also passed away, and many of the friends and neighbors Michael remembered from Millerville had either moved away or died during his long absence. By the time American officials finally cleared Michael to return to the United States in 2005, he faced the overwhelming challenge of reconnecting with a family that had spent 31 years believing he might be dead, and reintegrating into a country that had changed dramatically during his absence. But Michael's bureaucratic challenges weren't over. The military initially refused to acknowledge his service record or provide veterans benefits, because his long absence couldn't be easily explained or documented according to standard procedures. Michael was technically classified as a deserter because he had failed to report for duty for over 30 years, even though his failure to report had been due to captivity rather than choice. Michael had finally made it back to American soil, but the most difficult part of his journey was yet to come. Finding the courage to contact a family who had grieved his loss for decades and explaining why it had taken him 50 years to keep his promise to come home. Michael Sullivan arrived in the United States in November 2005, but he didn't immediately contact Sarah or attempt to return to Millerville. After 31 years of captivity, followed by 2 years of bureaucratic limbo, Michael was overwhelmed by the prospect of reintegrating into a society he barely recognized and reconnecting with family members who had built lives without him. The America Michael returned to was dramatically different from the country he had left in 1974. Technology, culture, politics, and social norms had all evolved in ways that made Michael feel like a stranger in his own homeland. He struggled with basic tasks like using modern phones, navigating computerized systems, and understanding cultural references that everyone else took for granted. Michael also suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder related to his decades of captivity, which made social interactions and emotional relationships extremely difficult. He had spent 30 years in survival mode, focused solely on staying alive and maintaining hope of return. Now that he was finally free, he didn't know how to function in normal social situations or process the complex emotions associated with his lost decades. The Veterans Administration provided Michael with counseling and medical care, but helping a veteran who had been held prisoner for 30 years was outside the scope of most treatment programs. Michael's experiences were so unique and extreme that mental health professionals struggled to understand how to help him heal from trauma that had lasted longer than most people's entire careers. Most challenging was Michael's fear of contacting Sarah and David. What if Sarah had moved on emotionally and didn't want to reopen the painful chapter of her life that involved his disappearance? What if David resented the father who had been absent for his entire childhood and adulthood? What if his family was better off without him, and his return would only cause new pain and disruption? Michael spent nearly 20 years living quietly in veterans' housing facilities, working with counselors to process his trauma and slowly building the emotional strength needed to reconnect with his family. He researched Sarah's life from a distance, learning that she still lived in the same area and had apparently never remarried. He discovered information about David's career, marriage, and children through public records and social media. But knowing about his family and actually contacting them were different challenges entirely. Michael was terrified that his return would be more harmful than helpful to people who had spent decades healing from his absence. The decision to finally make contact was prompted by Michael's declining health and his realization that if he waited much longer, he might die without ever seeing his family again. In 2024, at age 72, Michael was diagnosed with several serious medical conditions related to his years of captivity and malnutrition. "I promised I would come home," Michael told his counselor during their final session before he decided to contact Sarah. "I've kept that promise by staying alive and making it back to America, but I haven't really kept it until I see my family again and explain why it took me 50 years to get here." The knock on Sarah's door in October 2024 would force both Michael and Sarah to confront 50 years of loss, grief, and unanswered questions. But their reunion would prove that some promises are strong enough to survive decades of separation, and that love doesn't have expiration dates. When Sarah Sullivan opened her door on October 8, 2024, and saw Michael standing there, her first reaction was disbelief. The man at her door looked like Michael might have looked if he had aged 50 years. But Sarah had given up believing that such a reunion was possible. "Michael?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" "I promised I would come home," Michael replied, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I'm sorry it took me 50 years to keep that promise." The conversation that followed lasted 14 hours, as Michael explained his decades of captivity, his years of bureaucratic struggles to return to America, and his long process of building the courage to contact a family he had never stopped loving, but had been terrified to disappoint. Sarah shared her own story of 50 years spent raising their son alone, never knowing whether Michael was alive or dead, and building a life that always included space for his possible return. She showed Michael photographs of David's childhood, his wedding, and his children, 3 grandchildren who had grown up hearing stories about the grandfather they had never met. "I never stopped believing you would come home," Sarah told Michael as they looked through photo albums documenting 50 years of family life he had missed. "I couldn't remarry because I made a promise, too, to wait for you, no matter how long it took." The most emotional part of their reunion came when Sarah showed Michael the bedroom she had maintained for him throughout their 50 years of separation. She had kept his clothes, his personal belongings, and even the crib they had bought for their expected baby in 1974. The room looked like a museum dedicated to their interrupted life together. "I changed the sheets every week for 50 years, Sarah admitted. "I wanted everything to be ready for when you came home." Michael's reunion with David, who was now 49 years old, was more complicated but equally emotional. David had grown up with questions about his father that had shaped his entire identity and worldview. Meeting Michael answered those questions, but also created new ones about how to build a relationship with a father who was essentially a stranger despite being the most important missing piece of David's life. "I used to dream about what I would say to you if you ever came back," David told Michael during their first meeting. "But now that you're here, I realize that all I really want to know is that you never stopped trying to come home to us." Michael's 3 grandchildren, ages 15, 12, and 8, were fascinated by the grandfather who had lived through experiences they couldn't imagine and who represented a living connection to family history they had only heard about in stories. Michael Sullivan's return to his family in October 2024 marked the beginning of a new chapter that would test everyone's capacity for forgiveness, understanding, and adaptation. 50 years of separation couldn't be erased overnight, but the love that had sustained both Michael and Sarah through decades of uncertainty provided a foundation for rebuilding their relationship. Michael moved in with Sarah, not as a husband resuming a marriage, but as 2 elderly people who had shared the most important promise of their lives and were now finally able to fulfill it together. They slept in separate bedrooms initially, recognizing that they needed time to get to know each other again before they could resume the intimate relationship they had shared as young newlyweds. But gradually, as they spent time talking about their separate experiences during their 50 years apart, Michael and Sarah began to rediscover the connection that had made them fall in love as teenagers. They were different people than they had been in 1974, but the essential qualities that had drawn them together were still present. Sarah helped Michael navigate the modern world that had evolved during his absence, while Michael shared stories about his captivity that helped Sarah understand extraordinary circumstances that had kept him from returning sooner. They attended counseling together, learning how to process their shared trauma and build a relationship that acknowledged both their lost decades and their remaining years together. David's relationship with Michael developed more slowly, but proved equally meaningful. As a middle-aged man who had built his own family and career, David didn't need a father in the traditional sense, but he was deeply moved by Michael's stories of survival and his determination to return home. David began to understand that his father's absence hadn't been abandonment, but rather an extreme example of perseverance and love. "You kept your promise, Dad," David told Michael during a family barbecue 6 months after their reunion. "It took 50 years, but you came home. That's more than most people would have done." Michael's grandchildren embraced him with the uncomplicated acceptance that children often show toward unusual circumstances. They were fascinated by his stories about survival in the jungle, proud of his determination to return to his family, and happy to finally meet the grandfather they had heard about their entire lives. The community of Millerville, Pennsylvania, was amazed by Michael's return and the story of his 50-year journey home. Local newspapers covered the reunion, and veterans organizations used Michael's story to advocate for better support systems for missing soldiers and their families. Michael became an advocate for other missing in action families, working with organizations that search for soldiers who are still unaccounted for from various conflicts. His unique experience as someone who had been held captive for decades made him a powerful voice for families who were still waiting for answers about missing loved ones. Sarah and Michael's story inspired other military families to never give up hope that missing relatives might someday return, and their 50-year love story became a symbol of commitment that transcends time and circumstances. On November 12, 2024, exactly 50 years after David's birth, Michael met his son for the second time, but this time as a grandfather attending his grandson's birthday party. The celebration marked not just another year in a child's life, but the completion of a promise that had taken 5 decades to fulfill. Michael Sullivan had kept his word to return from war. It had required surviving 30 years of captivity, 20 years of bureaucratic struggles, and a lifetime of determination, but he had finally made it home to the family that had never stopped waiting for him. Some promises are worth waiting a lifetime to keep, and some love stories are strong enough to survive 50 years of separation.